Good morning. I'm Bronwen Neil from Macquarie University, and joining me today is Jonathan Zecher from Australian Catholic University to talk about his new book. So let me just introduce Jonathan. He's worked in the fields of patristics and late antique studies for more than a decade now, first as a lecturer at the University of Houston and now as a researcher for the Australian Catholic University in Melbourne. His 2022 book, Spiritual Direction as a Medical Art in Early Christian Monasticism, offers a detailed exploration of the thought world of women and men living in early Christian monastic communities as they entered into relationships of obedience and advice, the importance of medical knowledge, practice, and culture for Christian thought and communities. It shows how several early Christian writers applied the logic, knowledge, and practices of Hellenic medicine to develop their own practices of spiritual direction. Their different uses of medical logic and metaphors not only show us the thought world of late antique monasticism, but they would have decisive consequences for generations of Christians in late antiquity and the Middle Ages, who would learn to see themselves as sick or well, patients or healers within monastic communities. So let's dive straight in, Jonathan. What led you to ancient medicine and how does it differ from modern medicine?
Yeah, so I came to ancient medicine sort of by accident. I was doing a paper in 2015 at the Oxford Patristics Conference on John Climacus and the number of thoughts. And I was noticing all this imagery and this language that I kept thinking, gosh, this sounds really medical. I don't have another word for it. It sounds like medicine, but how would I know if that's what he's doing? How would I know that I'm not just kind of importing that? So I started to think I need to follow this up. I need to start thinking about this more. And about the same time, I started teaching a course for a health humanities program for pre-medical students. So students who were studying like biomedical engineering were also taking courses on history of medicine or philosophy of medicine or other kind of more humanistic courses. And so I got to teach a course on ancient medicine, magic, and miracles, kind of bringing these religious texts into conversation with the history of medicine. So it gave me a chance to explore ancient medicine, but also to learn about it in some ways through the eyes of these medical students or students who would become medical students who found the whole thing utterly bizarre and confusing, but who helped me think about what really was distinctive about ancient medicine. Because for them, the theories are all different. The knowledge is totally different. The technologies are different. You know, modern medicine in those respects bears almost no resemblance to ancient medicine. We don't have humoral theory. We're not worried about how much blood versus bile we've got going and if that's what's giving us bad dreams. But there are other sides of being in healthcare, of working in healthcare, that they could see resonances, or they could hear resonances, I guess I should say, with these ancient authors. So questions of clinical relationships, of communication, of how a physician or a healthcare worker might earn trust, and how they interact with patients, and what kind of goals of health they might have. They could hear those sorts of important questions and aspects of medicine being reflected in these ancient texts. And so I came to see that ancient medicine is in some ways totally different. And that's probably good that we're not trying to use leeches and change humors. But in other respects, especially in those kind of human dimensions of medicine, very similar. And the concerns that you can see in Galen and others are actually the kind of concerns that the contemporary physicians have. So this brought me into ancient medicine, and then for me, it's always been connected to these Christian writers and texts, because they're the ones whom I'm really focused on most of the time.
That's really interesting. So it had an interdisciplinary origin, your research.
Yeah.
So what difference does it make to focus on a medical background rather than, for example, an educational one? So another way to put it would be, what difference does it make to treat confession and penance as diagnosis, disease, and therapy, rather than, say, a judge exacting penalties or a teacher instructing students?
Yeah. That's the question, isn't it, that really underlies, I think, the book and the whole project. Because if you look at these monastic writings, they'll use imagery from education, from judicial systems or courts, and from medicine and kind of the clinical world of antiquity. And so in some way, all three models, and probably others besides, are in play. But I think by privileging the medical model, you see that when someone is treated as a patient who is sick, rather than a criminal who has committed a crime or a student who just needs to be taught a lesson, then you want to know different things about them. And you want to know different issues that might, or circumstances that might have led to their being in this position now, where they're having to confess this sin or this thought. And so you treat it in different ways. And those ways are organized by, I think, what was thought of as the medical art. And so here, I think what you can see, and especially from Galen, and I spent a lot of time with Galen in this, and there's a reason for that. One, there's a lot of Galen. It's not very interesting a lot of the time, but some of it's fascinating. Most of it's very repetitive and dry, but there's a lot of it, so that's helpful. But also by late antiquity, by the 4th century, 5th century, his works are providing the kind of core of the medical encyclopedias, the kind of physician's desk references of late antiquity. And so if you look at what Galen thinks medicine is and how it works, it's a way of organizing knowledge about human beings and a way of organizing practices of intervening on human beings to achieve certain ends, which is to say it's an art. It's a productive art. It produces health. And so to produce health, you have to know certain things about people and other things you may not worry about so much, like their criminal record isn't interesting to you where their humoral balance is. Because the therapy that's to be applied is going to answer a certain kind of cause and not something else. And so by looking at a medical model, you start to look at questions of diagnosis, of looking at visible symptoms to find hidden causes, prognosis, predictions of how these are likely to play out in future, pathologies, where you have a present symptom, but you start working backwards to an initial cause, and then kind of symptomology, which is sort of the organization of all these visible or sensible signs into meaningful frameworks that allow you to say, well, currently you're experiencing this symptom. You just had a wet dream. Well, why did you have a wet dream? Let's think about what lies behind that. And I say wet dreams not by accident, but because there's a chapter on wet dreams, because John Cassian was very concerned with those, which is intriguing in its own right. But you look at people in certain ways and think that you can understand them through these techniques. And then in turn, you think, all right, now I can intervene on them. I can apply therapies. I can do this either through regimen like diet and sleep and exercise, or through drugs or through surgery. And in monastic texts, the latter two become metaphors. You don't actually give drugs, but you might suggest that a harsh speech from the director is a kind of drug. It may be painful at the time, but it will have good effects. With things like regimen, you really are changing diet and sleep patterns. That's exactly the kinds of things that fasting and vigil are working on. So the medical model is really useful because there's already this huge overlap between what's being done in a kind of ascetic context and what's being done in a medical context. And then the other areas like drugs or surgery, these become really convenient metaphors and work very well for spiritual directors who need to understand the monks confessing to them, not just in terms of what's being said, but what might be behind it, that even the monks themselves aren't necessarily realizing was there. What were the initial thoughts? What were the demonic temptations that they may not have noticed at the time, but have led to this symptom? So you have the whole apparatus of medical logic of diagnosis, pathology, prognosis, therapy being brought to bear on monastic subjects. And it allows for practices of confession and penitence to be applied very carefully and with a good sense of how they're contributing to the growth and development of these monks.
Thank you. That's really interesting. I know from my own research on dreams that they were used in this period as indexes of spiritual health and obsessive thoughts in the same way. So you focus on texts from Evagrius Ponticus, John Cassian, Basil of Caesarea, and John Climacus. Why did you choose these authors, and how do students generally respond to them?
Right. So the answer to the first question is the short answer really is that I chose them because I like them. I think they're neat. And every time I read them, I get more out of them. So that's a very selfish reason to choose them, but it's true. I couldn't spend the last 7 years studying them if I didn't love them. But maybe the more scholarly reason that I'm supposed to give is that these are simultaneously good representatives of the kind of elite discourses that are being generated in the late antique Mediterranean, both in the Eastern and Western regions. So you have people like Basil and Evagrius, perhaps more in the East, but coming via Cassian into the West. So you have this kind of good representation. It's not everyone, and it's certainly not covering all areas of early Christian thought. Of course, readers will immediately notice there's no Coptic writers, there's no Syriac. Originally, I'd wanted to have this more expansive version, but I think both because of my own skill sets and because of time and space, I felt it was better to focus in on these. But it's also true that these particular writers are very influential as well in both the medieval West via the rule of Benedict, who says you should be reading your Basil and your Cassian, and in the East, where someone like John Climacus, he's not all that popular among scholars today, but every Byzantine monastery from the 11th century on has to read him every Lent, and they still do in the Eastern Orthodox churches. So you have these enormously influential texts. And so they seemed like good people to think with in both of those ways. Students respond to them, I think, through the lens of their own experience, which is maybe how we all respond to authors like these. And the students that I've taught these authors to have been, by and large, if not medical students or pre-medical students who are taking classes on like spirituality of health or religion and health. And so they're often mostly focused on contemporary healthcare. And so the basic response initially is that they think they're weird. Which, hey, fair enough. They are kind of weird. They're the best kind of weird, I think, but that's okay, because they're the kind of weird that students seem to find the things they take for granted reflected in the weirdness and questioned. And so when they can, as I said earlier, they can say, they're concerned with the same kinds of things. They're worried about trust and clinical communication, but they're doing it in this really different way. And you go, yeah, well, why do we think their way is worse or our way is better? Or what's different about them? Or what can we learn from this? And so it becomes this great moment where through the weirdness, students have really been able to reflect on the kind of, especially healthcare professionals they're hoping to become, and the kind of concerns that they might share with patients. Now, for students of late antiquity, they just kind of go, yeah, I know Evagrius. Evagrius is cool. They don't tend to know Climacus so well, but they tend to like him when they meet him because he's a fun one, and he has lots of jokes, which I think is good for students.
Yeah, of course, your first book was on John Climacus, so
that's
listeners
right.
can go to that if they're more interested in him.
Well, he's one of those authors that, we all have an author that you can go back to them once a year and they're always new. For me, Climacus is like that. I will never get tired of reading the latter.
So are there consequences, do you think, for the contemporary world to thinking about monastic practices in the context of ancient medicine?
I do think there are consequences and maybe ways of extending this into the contemporary world. And so the first is for contemporaries who are interested in or work in spiritual direction, because although this is about early Christian monasticism, and I mentioned that, for example, in Eastern Orthodox monasteries, they still read the latter every Lent, and they read Basil and they read Evagrius, though sometimes under the name Nihilus, right? and Cassian too, in translated into Greek and in the Philokalia. So these are living texts for a lot of people, both in monasteries, absolutely, but also outside of monasteries in parish contexts, certainly in traditions like the Eastern Orthodox or Roman Catholic, but also contemporary Protestant Christian denominations as well, that have an interest in practices of spiritual direction, being able to tap into those traditions and see what's at work in them, I think can provide useful points of reflection and maybe even tools going forward. The other place where I think there are consequences, and I've probably been hinting at this all the way through. I talk about having taught in a health humanities or medical humanities program. I think this kind of thing, this kind of study, and this is just one example of I think a number of studies that have been coming out in recent years around the intersections of religion, medicine, health, disability, especially in late antiquity and classical antiquity, that these kinds of studies can contribute to these developing fields of medical or health humanities, which are by and large what these refer to, if listeners or viewers aren't familiar with them. They're very popular programs in the United States especially, but elsewhere too, certainly in the UK now, where humanistic disciplines, be they creative writing or arts or philosophy or history or literature, any number of things, are brought to bear on medical and health professional education to fill out the very technical learning that is commonly associated with those schools, and to reclaim in some ways the humanistic sides of medical practice, to ask questions, critical questions of what we think constitutes health and why, and how we think we can best deliver that to people, especially in very industrial and industrialized healthcare systems. And so these fields are bearing a lot of fruit in changing the face of medical education in places like the US and the UK. And I think more and more of the world, it's a good thing. But there are two places that have really been identified as real growth opportunities. I don't want to say deficiencies, but certainly growth opportunities. One is history. For most medical and health humanities programs, history begins in the 19th or early 20th century. Or early 20th centuries, maybe 1910 with the Flexner Report, which redefined medical education in the US and redefined the professionalization of medicine as a science. They don't necessarily read a lot before that. Maybe you're reading with Foucault and you're like, well, when was the clinic born? 18th century France? Okay, before that, maybe not so much. And so looking at what is shared with ancient medicine, as different as it is in some ways, can be really useful for reflecting on the same kinds of questions that are being brought up with a very presentist outlook. The other area that I think one could identify for growth is a concern with religion and religious commitments among people who get sick. A lot of people who get sick are also faithful members of some religion or another, have some kind of spiritual practice or spirituality, if not an organized religion, for example. Well, this is not often discussed in a lot of the health humanities literature. It's beginning to be, but it's still just a small amount in comparison. And so I think it's worthwhile thinking about these moments, and not just short moments, but long historical periods where there was not just an intersection, but a real confluence of religious and medical discourses, where you could be doing something like spiritual direction in a monastery and actually think that what you're doing is a kind of medical art. It's not simply being a physician, but it is a kind of physician. And you take that very seriously. And so thinking about how those have come together in the past, and especially a past that is formative for a lot of people today in certain religious traditions, is going to be useful for how the spiritual is incorporated into what's already an emphasis on the bio, the psycho, and the social, the body, the mind, and the environment. Well, let's also talk about the spirit. Let's also talk about the faith. Let's also talk about how that impacts people's health, what they think healthy looks like, and how they want to get there. And so I think that's for me, a really exciting place for the application of these kinds of findings. Yeah.
So you're saying that understanding the history of the intersection between spiritual health and medical health, if you can call it that, allows for a more holistic approach to modern medicine.
Yeah,
that's really, yeah, it's significant and exciting. So finally, who do you think would benefit most from reading this book, and why?
Yes. Short answer, everyone. Everyone should read this book, always. But no, probably not. I think the standard group of people who are already interested in late antique cultures and early Christian studies, absolutely. I think this is kind of hopefully of broad enough interest. But I think there's a couple other groups that I'm hopeful would find it useful, although they may not realize that. And the first is historians of medicine. I really wrote this in the interest of furthering conversations between scholars of religion or patristics and scholars of ancient medicine, who have a lot to say to each other, but haven't necessarily been saying it yet. There are these moments, these kind of moments of coming together, but I do hope we can have more of that. So this book is written with both groups in mind. And then I think a third group is actually in kind of health humanities programs or pre-health professional programs. If people are interested in courses on the spiritual dimensions of health, this can be useful alongside others. So kind of three groups, both students and I think professional scholars as well. Hopefully we'll find something in there for them. Oh, and Byzantinists. Sorry, 4 groups, Byzantinists.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Bronwen. I really appreciate your time.
Will you just throw up your the cover of your book for a moment? And if you'd like to hear more from Jonathan, you can watch the video on malady and therapy of memory in early monastic spiritual direction, which is on the AIEP YouTube channel. So thank you again, Jonathan, and we'll leave it there.
Thank you very much.